I pretend to be a better person than I really am, and it works incredibly well. Everyone thinks I'm the kindest, most thoughtful person they know. But behind this carefully crafted mask of compassion lies someone calculating, impatient, and manipulative. The terrifying part isn't that I'm fooling everyone, it's that I'm starting to fool myself too. I'm Scarlett, and I'm 29 years old. This story is about the masks we wear, the people we pretend to be, and the moment I realized that my greatest strength might also be my most dangerous weakness. Let me take you back to where this all began, because understanding my childhood is crucial to understanding how I became someone who weaponized kindness for personal gain. I grew up in a household where emotional manipulation was as common as breathing, though it took me years to recognize it for what it was. My mother, Patricia, was a master of passive-aggressive control, and my father, Gerald, was a conflict-avoidant people-pleaser who would do anything to maintain peace. Our house in suburban Minneapolis was always immaculate, always perfectly decorated for whatever season or holiday was approaching, and always filled with visitors who came to seek Patricia's advice or simply bask in her seemingly endless warmth and wisdom. Patricia had this way of making everyone who entered our home feel special and valued, remembering details about their lives that even close friends might forget, offering exactly the right words of comfort or encouragement for whatever situation they were facing. But Patricia's kindness wasn't spontaneous or natural, it was strategic and calculated with military precision. She kept detailed mental files on everyone in our social circle, tracking their birthdays, anniversaries, children's achievements, marital problems, health concerns, and career challenges. She'd use this information to position herself as the thoughtful friend who never forgot important dates, the caring neighbor who checked in during difficult times, and the wise confidant who always knew what to say. I watched her navigate social situations with the precision of a chess grandmaster, always 3 moves ahead, always positioning herself as the victim or the helper, never the aggressor. People absolutely adored her. Neighbors would stop by just to chat about their problems, teachers would praise her involvement in school activities, and other parents would seek her advice on everything from potty training to college applications. She was universally regarded as one of the kindest, most selfless people in our community. But behind closed doors, Patricia was calculating and cold in ways that confused and disturbed me as a child. She'd analyze every social interaction with forensic detail, dissecting people's weaknesses and motivations with surgical precision. Mrs. Henderson acts superior because she's insecure about her weight, she'd tell me after a PTA meeting, her voice taking on a clinical tone that contrasted sharply with the warm friendliness she'd displayed just minutes earlier. If you compliment her garden and ask for advice about flowers, she'll do anything you ask. People like her need to feel useful and appreciated. She treated relationships like a complex game where the objective was to accumulate social capital and influence while maintaining the appearance of selfless generosity. Every dinner party she hosted, every gift she gave, every favor she offered was calculated to strengthen her position in our community's social hierarchy. She'd volunteer for the most visible charitable causes, not out of genuine compassion for the beneficiaries, but because it enhanced her reputation as someone who cared about others. My father enabled this behavior by constantly praising Patricia's people skills and encouraging me to learn from her example. "Your mother has such a gift with people," he'd say, his voice filled with genuine admiration that made me question my own discomfort with her methods. "She always knows exactly what to say to make someone feel better. You should pay attention to how she handles different situations, it's a real art form." What Gerald didn't seem to recognize, or chose not to acknowledge, was that Patricia's gift wasn't empathy, it was strategic emotional intelligence designed to serve her own interests. She didn't actually care about Mrs. Henderson's insecurities or the Smith family's financial struggles or the Johnsons' marital problems. She cared about being perceived as someone who cared, which was a very different thing entirely. As a child, I found Patricia's approach both fascinating and repulsive. I could see how effective her methods were. Doors opened for her that remained closed to others, people went out of their way to help her, and she seemed to glide through life without the social friction that plagued most people. But I also sensed something fundamentally dishonest about the whole performance, something that made me uncomfortable even when I couldn't articulate exactly what bothered me about it. As a teenager, I initially rebelled against Patricia's approach, finding it manipulative and dishonest in ways that violated my adolescent sense of authenticity and moral purity. I prided myself on being direct and genuine, often to my own detriment. I'd speak my mind in situations where diplomacy would have served me better, refuse to play social games that seemed beneath me, and express my real opinions even when they were unpopular or inconvenient. This commitment to authenticity resulted in a series of social disasters that left me feeling isolated and resentful. Friend groups excluded me because I wouldn't participate in gossip or pretend to like people I found annoying. Teachers found me difficult because I'd challenge their authority when I disagreed with their methods or policies. I missed out on leadership positions, social opportunities, and academic advantages that went to classmates who were better at managing relationships and perceptions. The most painful example of how my authenticity was sabotaging my success came during my junior year, when I was passed over for editor of the school newspaper despite having superior writing skills and more journalism experience than any other candidate. The position went to Madison Kelly, a girl who was pleasant but unremarkable, whose main qualification seemed to be that everyone liked her. Madison won because she'd spent 3 years building relationships with teachers, administrators, and fellow students. She remembered everyone's birthdays, complimented people's outfits, and had this magical ability to make everyone feel special and important when she talked to them. She'd bring homemade cookies to newspaper meetings, volunteer to help struggling classmates with their articles, and always found ways to highlight other people's contributions rather than seeking credit for herself. Her campaign for editor wasn't based on qualifications or innovative ideas for the paper, it was based on the relationships she'd built and the loyalty she'd inspired. Students voted for her because they genuinely liked her and wanted to see her succeed. Teachers supported her candidacy because she'd made them feel valued and appreciated. Even I had to admit that she was universally beloved in ways that had nothing to do with her actual journalism abilities. Watching Madison's victory was like seeing Patricia's methods played out on a smaller stage, and for the first time, I began to understand the practical value of strategic kindness. Madison wasn't necessarily a better leader or a more talented writer, but she was infinitely better at managing people's emotions and perceptions. She'd figured out something that I was too stubborn to accept: in most situations, being liked matters more than being right. That realization planted a seed that would grow throughout my college years. I started paying closer attention to how successful people navigated social dynamics, and I noticed patterns that echoed Patricia's approach everywhere I looked. The students who got the best internships weren't necessarily the smartest, they were the ones who'd built relationships with professors and made themselves memorable through thoughtful gestures and genuine seeming interest in their mentor's research. The people who landed leadership positions in clubs and organizations weren't always the most qualified, they were the most popular, the ones who'd made other members feel included and valued. Success in almost every area seemed to depend more on social skills and relationship management than on technical competence or raw talent. The world was rewarding people who understood that human emotions and perceptions were more powerful than facts or merit. During my freshman year at Arizona State University, I decided to conduct a careful experiment. Instead of being my naturally direct and sometimes abrasive self, I would consciously adopt some of Patricia's strategies and observe the results. I started small, making subtle changes to how I interacted with people rather than attempting a complete personality overhaul that might seem fake or manipulative. I began remembering people's names more consistently and using them in conversation, which I'd learned from psychology classes made people feel more important and connected. I started asking follow-up questions about things classmates had mentioned in previous conversations, demonstrating that I listened to them and cared about their experiences. I offered genuine-seeming compliments about their achievements, appearances, or personalities, always being specific enough to seem authentic rather than generic. The results were immediate and dramatic in ways that both thrilled and disturbed me. People began seeking me out for study groups, inviting me to parties I wouldn't have been included in otherwise, and treating me like someone whose presence made social situations more enjoyable. Professors remembered me more favorably, often commenting on my engagement and thoughtfulness in ways that led to better grades and opportunities for research assistant positions. But the most significant change was how people began describing me to others when they thought I wasn't listening. I started overhearing myself referred to as really sweet, incredibly thoughtful, and such a genuine person. These descriptions felt surreal because I knew that my kindness was calculated rather than spontaneous, strategic rather than authentic. I was performing empathy so convincingly that people couldn't tell the difference between my act and the real thing. By my sophomore year, I'd refined my approach into a sophisticated system of social manipulation disguised as genuine caring. I kept detailed mental notes about people's interests, fears, insecurities, and aspirations, then used that information to position myself as a trusted confidant and supporter. I'd remember that Jessica was stressed about her parents' messy divorce and make a point of checking in with her regularly, offering to listen if she needed to talk and bringing her favorite coffee when she seemed particularly down. I'd recall that Marcus was anxious about his calculus class and struggling with concepts that came easily to me, so I'd offer to help him study in ways that made him feel supported rather than stupid. I'd noticed that Sarah seemed lonely and isolated, often eating by herself or sitting alone in the library, so I'd make an effort to include her in group activities and introduce her to people who shared her interests in environmental activism. None of these gestures were entirely selfless, though I convinced myself at the time that I was being genuinely helpful. Each act of kindness was also an investment in social capital that I could leverage later when I needed support, favors, or advocacy. Jessica became a fiercely loyal friend who would defend me in any conflict and spread positive stories about my character to anyone who would listen. Marcus became an enthusiastic promoter of my tutoring abilities, telling other struggling students that I was the most patient and effective teacher he'd ever encountered. Sarah became devoted to me in a way that bordered on worship, always eager to support my initiatives and promote my interests within her activist circles. Through her, I gained access to a whole network of socially conscious students who valued compassion and service, people who were impressed by my apparent dedication to helping others and my genuine concern for social justice causes that I privately found boring or irrelevant. The system worked so well that I began applying it beyond college social dynamics, recognizing that the same principles could be used in professional settings to advance my career. During internships, I'd bring coffee for my supervisors without being asked, remember details about their personal lives and ask thoughtful follow-up questions, and position myself as the helpful, eager intern who made everyone's job easier and more pleasant. I'd volunteer for extra projects and assignments, not out of genuine enthusiasm for the work, but because I knew that visibility and perceived dedication were more valuable than actual competence in most workplace environments. I'd stay late to help overwhelmed colleagues meet deadlines, offer to take on additional responsibilities during busy periods, and always maintain a positive attitude even when dealing with frustrating situations or difficult people. These behaviors earned me glowing recommendations, job offers from companies where I'd interned, and a reputation as someone who was not only competent but also a pleasure to work with. Supervisors would praise my work ethic, colleagues would request to work with me on future projects, and I'd often hear feedback that I was exactly the kind of person they wanted to hire and promote within their organizations. After graduation, I landed a marketing coordinator position at a mid-sized advertising agency in Phoenix, largely because the hiring manager, Diana, had been completely charmed by my apparent thoughtfulness and genuine interest in her company during the interview process. I'd researched not only the agency's client base and recent campaigns, but also Diana's professional background and personal interests, discovering through social media that she'd recently adopted a rescue dog and was passionate about animal welfare. During the interview, I'd steered the conversation toward her adoption experience, expressing genuine-seeming admiration for her compassion toward animals and sharing stories about my own volunteer work at local shelters, work that I'd actually done primarily to build my resume and network with other volunteers who might be useful professional contacts. The job interview became a bonding session about pet rescue and animal rights, and Diana later told me that my genuine warmth and shared values had been the deciding factor in hiring me over other candidates with similar qualifications. At the agency, I quickly established myself as the office sweetheart through a carefully orchestrated campaign of strategic kindness. I'd bring homemade cookies and pastries on Monday mornings, claiming that I loved to bake and needed people to help me eat the results. I'd organize birthday celebrations for colleagues, keeping track of everyone's special dates and making sure each person felt valued and remembered on their day. I maintained a mental calendar of important events in my coworkers' lives, anniversaries, children's milestones, family visits, medical appointments, and would check in with people at appropriate times to show that I cared about their personal well-being. I'd stay late to help overwhelmed colleagues meet deadlines, offer to cover shifts when people needed time off for emergencies, and always maintain a positive, supportive attitude even during stressful periods or when dealing with difficult clients. My reputation for kindness became so well established that people began confiding in me about personal problems, workplace frustrations, and career anxieties. I'd listen sympathetically to their concerns, offer thoughtful advice based on my understanding of their personalities and situations, and position myself as a trusted ally who could be counted on for support and discretion. But internally, I was cataloging all of this information, building detailed psychological profiles of my colleagues and using their vulnerabilities to understand office politics and anticipate conflicts or opportunities. When Jennifer complained about feeling undervalued by our creative director, I'd file away the information about her insecurities and ambitions. When David expressed frustration about being passed over for a promotion, I'd note his resentment and consider how it might affect his future behavior and allegiances. This intelligence gathering allowed me to navigate workplace dynamics with remarkable effectiveness. I could predict how different people would react to various proposals or changes, identify potential sources of conflict before they erupted, and position myself as a valuable mediator and problem solver. I became indispensable not just because of my marketing skills, but because of my ability to manage relationships and maintain team harmony. Within 18 months, I'd been promoted twice, first to senior marketing coordinator, then to marketing team leader, not because my work was exceptional, though it was consistently competent, but because everyone liked and trusted me. Diana had become something of a mentor, regularly praising my emotional intelligence and natural leadership abilities to upper management. My colleagues viewed me as someone who brought positive energy to the workplace and made everyone feel valued and appreciated. But the more successful my strategy became, the more uncomfortable I grew with the level of deception involved. I was living a double life where my public persona bore little resemblance to my private thoughts and feelings. At work and in social situations, I was endlessly patient, understanding, and supportive, always ready with encouraging words and helpful gestures. But alone in my apartment, I'd vent about people's stupidity and incompetence, analyze their weaknesses with cold detachment, and plan my next moves in the ongoing chess game of social manipulation. The cognitive dissonance became particularly acute during my relationship with Tyler, a graphic designer I met through work connections at an industry networking event. Tyler was genuinely kind in ways that seemed effortless and authentic, the sort of person who rescued injured birds he found on sidewalks, volunteered at homeless shelters without posting about it on social media, and remembered the names and stories of every barista, security guard, and janitor he encountered regularly. He fell in love with the version of me that I presented to the world, frequently telling people that I was the most caring and thoughtful person he'd ever met, and that my compassion and generosity inspired him to be a better person. He'd share stories about my kindness with his friends and family, describing how I remembered his coworkers' birthdays, brought soup when he was sick, and always knew exactly what to say when he was stressed or discouraged about his career. With Tyler, I found myself trapped in my own performance in ways that were both exhausting and terrifying. He'd grown to love qualities that weren't authentically mine, which meant that being genuine with him would risk destroying the relationship that had become central to my personal happiness. So I maintained the act even in private moments, continuing to perform empathy and selflessness even when no one else was watching. I'd express concern about social causes that I didn't really care about, volunteer for charity events that bored me senseless, and pretend to be emotionally moved by sob stories that left me feeling nothing but mild irritation at people's self-pity and poor decision-making. I'd listen to Tyler's friends discuss their problems and offer supportive advice while internally judging their inability to handle basic adult responsibilities. The strain of maintaining this level of performance 24 hours a day was exhausting in ways I hadn't anticipated. I felt like I was constantly on stage, never able to relax into my natural personality because my natural personality was apparently unlovable. The person Tyler adored was a carefully constructed fiction, and I couldn't figure out how to gradually introduce my authentic self without destroying everything we'd built together. The situation reached a crisis point during Tyler's birthday party, which I'd organized with my usual meticulous attention to detail and strategic thinking about what would create the maximum positive impact. I'd invited all his friends from work, college, and his various hobby groups, ensuring that everyone he cared about would be included. I'd decorated his apartment with personalized touches that referenced his interests in vintage motorcycles, craft beer, and indie music. I'd arranged for his favorite local band to perform a surprise acoustic set in his living room, contacted his estranged brother to invite him as a special surprise, and prepared a photo slideshow of their friendship memories that I'd secretly compiled by reaching out to dozens of mutual acquaintances for pictures and stories. The party was a masterpiece of thoughtful planning that demonstrated my deep understanding of Tyler's personality and relationships. Everyone was amazed by the thoughtfulness and effort I'd put into the celebration, and Tyler was visibly emotional about how perfectly I'd captured his interests and priorities. His friends kept commenting on what an incredible girlfriend I was, how lucky Tyler was to have found someone who cared so much about making him happy, and how obvious it was that I truly understood and appreciated him as a person. But as I watched Tyler give a heartfelt speech thanking me for being the most thoughtful, loving partner anyone could ask for, I felt nothing but emptiness and a growing sense of panic. The party was a performance, like everything else in my life had become. I'd organized it not out of love or genuine desire to make Tyler happy, but because I knew it would reinforce my reputation as an exceptional girlfriend and secure his devotion even more completely. Every detail had been calculated for maximum emotional impact, every surprise designed to create the impression that I was uniquely attentive to his needs and desires. The photo slideshow wasn't a labor of love, it was a strategic demonstration of how much effort I was willing to invest in our relationship. The surprise appearance of his brother wasn't motivated by genuine care for their family dynamic, it was designed to position me as someone who understood the importance of family reconciliation. That night, after all the guests had left and Tyler had fallen asleep beside me, overwhelmed by gratitude and love for the perfect girlfriend who'd created such a meaningful celebration, I sat in his living room surrounded by the debris of the party I'd engineered. I stared at the remnants of decorations, empty bottles, and leftover cake, and realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd done something kind without calculating the potential return on investment. Every gesture, every word of support, every act of apparent selflessness had been carefully calibrated to serve my interests in some way. Even my relationship with the person I supposedly loved most had become another performance designed to maintain my image and secure the benefits that came with being perceived as an exceptional partner. The realization that I'd become someone I barely recognized was terrifying, but not terrifying enough to make me stop. The benefits of my strategic kindness were too significant to abandon. At work, I'd been promoted to marketing team leader with a substantial salary increase and my own office. My social life was rich and fulfilling, with invitations to exclusive parties, weddings, and events that other people struggled to access. People sought my advice on everything from career decisions to relationship problems, treating me like someone whose wisdom and insights were genuinely valuable. I'd been asked to serve on nonprofit boards, invited to join professional organizations, and recommended for opportunities that typically required years of networking to achieve. My reputation for kindness and reliability had become a currency that bought me access to experiences and connections that money alone couldn't provide. But I was also starting to lose track of who I really was underneath all the performance. When Tyler would ask about my genuine feelings or preferences about important decisions, where we should vacation, what kind of home we might want to buy together, whether I wanted children, I'd sometimes struggle to identify my authentic opinions because I'd become so accustomed to saying what I thought people wanted to hear. My real personality had been buried so deeply under layers of strategic behavior that I wasn't sure it still existed in any meaningful way. I'd spent so much energy becoming the person that others would love and admire that I'd forgotten who I was when nobody was watching. The mask had become so comfortable and natural that I couldn't tell where it ended and my real face began. The wake-up call that finally forced me to confront this identity crisis came from an unexpected source, my younger sister Emma, who was visiting from college during her spring break. Emma had always been the more naturally empathetic of us, genuinely caring about others without any visible ulterior motives or strategic thinking. She'd volunteer at animal shelters because she loved animals, donate money to charity because she wanted to help people, and offer support to friends simply because she hated seeing them suffer. During her visit, she made an observation that stopped me cold and shattered the comfortable delusion I'd built around my behavior. We were having coffee at my favorite cafe, and she was telling me about some drama in her sorority where girls were competing for leadership positions through various forms of manipulation and social maneuvering. "You know what's weird," she said, stirring sugar into her latte while looking at me with the direct, unfiltered honesty that I remembered from our childhood. "Everyone always talks about how incredibly kind and generous you are, but I don't think I've ever actually seen you do something nice without getting something in return. Even when we were kids, you'd only help me with homework if I'd do one of your chores or give you something you wanted." Her words hit me like a physical blow because they were completely accurate. Even my relationship with Emma, my own sister, had been fundamentally transactional. I'd positioned myself as the helpful older sister when I needed her loyalty or support, but I rarely offered assistance without expecting some form of compensation or reciprocation. "I'm not criticizing you," Emma continued, seeming to notice my stunned expression and slightly defensive body language. "It's actually pretty impressive how you've figured out how to get what you want by making people feel good about themselves. I just wonder sometimes if you ever get tired of performing all the time, or if you even remember what you're like when you're not trying to make everyone love you." That question haunted me for weeks after Emma returned to school. Was I tired of performing? I honestly wasn't sure anymore because the performance had become so natural, so automatic, that I couldn't tell where the act ended and my real personality began. I'd been strategically kind for so long that the behaviors had become habitual, muscle memory that activated without conscious thought or decision-making. But Emma's observation also forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth about the foundation my entire adult life was built on. my success in career, relationships, and social status was based on emotional manipulation. My promotions at work, my relationship with Tyler, my friendships, my reputation in the community, all of it depended on people believing I was someone I wasn't sure I actually was. If they discovered the calculating, strategic person behind the compassionate mask, everything I'd built could collapse overnight. My career could stagnate if colleagues and supervisors realized that my helpfulness was self-serving rather than altruistic. Tyler might leave if he understood that the woman he loved was a carefully constructed performance designed to secure his devotion. Friends might distance themselves if they recognized that my support came with invisible strings attached. The anxiety of maintaining this double life began affecting my mental health in ways I hadn't anticipated or prepared for. I started having panic attacks during social events, terrified that someone would see through my performance and expose me as a fraud. I'd lie awake at night replaying conversations, wondering if I'd revealed too much of my true nature or failed to maintain the persona that everyone expected from me. I became hypervigilant about my behavior, second-guessing every word and gesture to ensure they aligned with my established image. The spontaneity that had once made my kindness seem natural became impossible as I calculated the potential consequences of every interaction. I felt like I was walking on a tightrope where any misstep could result in a devastating fall that would destroy everything I'd worked to build. At the same time, I was becoming increasingly resentful of the people who benefited from my fake kindness without recognizing the effort and calculation involved. When colleagues came to me with problems, I'd listen sympathetically while internally judging their incompetence and weakness. When friends sought advice about their relationships or career challenges, I'd offer supportive words while privately thinking they were making obviously poor decisions that anyone with basic common sense could avoid. The disconnect between my public responses and private thoughts was creating a toxic buildup of unexpressed frustration and contempt that I had no healthy outlet for releasing. I couldn't discuss these feelings with Tyler because they contradicted the compassionate image he'd fallen in love with. I couldn't share them with friends because they would destroy my reputation for empathy and understanding. The situation became completely unsustainable during a company retreat where I was expected to facilitate team-building exercises and maintain my role as the office morale booster and relationship manager. For 3 days, I performed nonstop enthusiasm and supportiveness while internally screaming about the stupidity of corporate bonding activities and the mediocrity of colleagues who needed manufactured fun to work together effectively. I led trust falls and communication exercises while wanting to shake people and tell them that their professional problems stemmed from their own laziness and poor judgment rather than systemic issues or bad luck. I organized group discussions about workplace culture while privately cataloging everyone's personal failings and character flaws. By the final night, I was so emotionally drained that I barely managed to maintain my facade during the closing dinner and awards ceremony. That's when I realized I had reached a breaking point where I needed to make a fundamental choice: either find a way to integrate my authentic self with my public persona, or continue living as a fraud until the performance completely consumed whatever remained of my real personality. The stakes felt enormous because admitting to strategic manipulation would destroy my reputation and relationships, but continuing the deception was destroying my mental health and sense of self. I decided to start with small experiments, testing whether people could accept slightly less perfect versions of me without rejecting me entirely. Instead of always being available to help with every request, I began occasionally saying I was too busy or stressed to take on additional responsibilities. Instead of always being positive and supportive, I started expressing mild frustration or disagreement in low-stakes situations where the consequences would be minimal. I was essentially conducting careful tests to see how much authenticity my relationships could withstand before people became disillusioned with me or decided I wasn't the person they thought I was. The results were surprisingly mixed and more complex than I'd expected. Some people seemed relieved to see me display normal human emotions and limitations, as if my constant perfection had been intimidating or exhausting for them to be around. Diana actually commented that my occasional displays of stress and frustration made me seem more relatable and approachable as a leader. "It's nice to know you're not actually superhuman," she said with a laugh after I admitted to feeling overwhelmed by a particularly challenging project timeline. Several colleagues mentioned that they'd always felt slightly inadequate around me because I seemed to handle everything with such grace and competence. Learning that I also struggled with work-life balance and occasionally felt frustrated with clients or internal processes made them feel more comfortable sharing their own challenges and asking for support when they needed it. But other relationships struggled to adapt to my slightly more authentic behavior in ways that confirmed my fears about the fragility of connections built on false premises. Tyler seemed confused and concerned when I expressed genuine irritation about things that bothered me, asking if I was feeling okay or if something was wrong in our relationship that was making me seem different and less like my usual supportive self. Some friends interpreted my reduced availability and occasional displays of negative emotions as rejection or loss of interest in their friendships, despite my explanations that I was trying to maintain better boundaries and be more honest about my feelings. They'd grown accustomed to a version of me that was always accommodating and positive, and any deviation from that established pattern felt like a fundamental change in our relationship dynamic. The most challenging aspect of this transition was figuring out which parts of my kind persona were genuinely part of my character and which were purely strategic performance. I realized that some of my helpful behaviors had become intrinsically rewarding over time, regardless of their original manipulative purposes. I genuinely enjoyed organizing events that brought people together, even if I'd initially done it for social capital and visibility. I found real satisfaction in helping colleagues solve problems and achieve their goals, even if I'd originally volunteered to increase my reputation and demonstrate my value to the organization. The skills I'd developed through strategic manipulation, reading people's emotions, understanding their needs, finding ways to make them feel valued, had become genuine capabilities that I used automatically rather than consciously. This discovery led to a profound shift in how I understood my own personality and moral character. Maybe I wasn't a naturally empathetic person pretending to be kind for selfish reasons. Maybe I was someone who had learned to be kind through practice and repetition, even if the initial motivation had been strategic rather than altruistic. The behaviors that had started as manipulation had, over time, developed into genuine skills and sources of personal satisfaction. I began to see my analytical approach to relationships not as pure deception, but as a form of emotional intelligence that many people lack entirely. I'd learned to understand what people needed and how to provide it effectively, which created genuine value even if my motives weren't entirely selfless. The fact that my kindness was calculated didn't necessarily make it less beneficial to the people who received it. This realization allowed me to start integrating my strategic nature with my reputation for compassion rather than hiding one behind the other. Instead of pretending that my helpfulness was purely spontaneous, I began framing my observational skills and analytical thinking as professional strengths that made me better at understanding and supporting other people. At work, this integration proved incredibly valuable and opened up new opportunities for advancement. I started being more open about my systematic approach to team dynamics and client relationships, positioning it as strategic thinking and emotional intelligence rather than manipulation. Diana began involving me in higher-level planning discussions because she valued my insights into how different stakeholders would respond to various proposals and initiatives. My ability to predict and manage emotional responses became a recognized professional asset rather than a secret weapon I used to advance my own interests. I was promoted to senior marketing manager with responsibility for client relationship management, specifically because of my demonstrated ability to understand people's motivations and find ways to address their concerns effectively. In my personal relationships, the integration process was more challenging but ultimately more rewarding than continuing to live behind a mask. I had honest conversations with close friends about my tendency to overthink social dynamics and plan my interactions strategically. To my surprise, most of them found this revelation interesting rather than disturbing or off-putting. That explains why you're so good at knowing exactly what to say in difficult situations, my friend Cassandra said when I confessed my analytical approach to friendship. I always wondered how you seem to understand people so well and remember all the important details about everyone's lives. I just thought you were naturally more observant than the rest of us. The most difficult and important conversation was with Tyler, who deserved to know that the person he'd fallen in love with was more complex and calculating than she'd initially appeared. I explained that while my caring behaviors toward him were genuine, they were also influenced by my analytical approach to relationships and my strategic thinking about what would make our partnership successful. I told him that I'd learned to be kind partly because kindness was effective at achieving the outcomes I wanted, but that over time, it had become a genuine part of who I was rather than just a tool I used to manipulate people. I admitted that some of my thoughtful gestures had been calculated to secure his devotion, but that my feelings for him were real even if my methods of expressing them were sometimes strategic. Tyler's response surprised and relieved me in ways I hadn't expected. I kind of suspected something like that, he said, taking my hand while we sat on his couch having this terrifying conversation that could potentially end our relationship. You're too good at reading people and situations for it to be purely instinctual. But honestly, does it matter why you started being kind if you actually are kind now? The help you've given me, the support you've provided, the thoughtful things you've done, that was all real, regardless of how you learned to do it. His acceptance of my more complex nature was liberating in ways I hadn't anticipated. For the first time in years, I felt like someone knew me authentically and still chose to be with me. The relationship became stronger and more intimate because it was based on reality rather than performance, even if that reality was more complicated than the simple narrative of natural kindness that I'd initially presented. Today, I still use strategic thinking in my relationships and career advancement, but I no longer see it as fundamentally deceptive or morally problematic. I've learned to be transparent about my analytical nature while continuing to use those skills to create positive outcomes for myself and others. My kindness may have started as a calculated strategy, but it has evolved into something more genuine through years of practice and habit formation. I've also come to understand that authenticity doesn't require abandoning all strategic behavior, it requires being honest about who you are, including the parts of yourself that are calculating, ambitious, or self-interested. Most people are more strategic in their relationships than they're willing to admit, and pretending otherwise is just another form of performance and social manipulation. The question that once tormented me, whether I was faking kindness or actually becoming kind through practice, now seems less important than the outcomes I create and the person I choose to be going forward. I may have learned empathy for initially selfish reasons, but I've learned it nonetheless, and those skills have become genuine capabilities that I use to help others and advance my career in ways that benefit everyone involved. I'm no longer afraid of being discovered as someone who thinks strategically about relationships and social dynamics, because I've learned to own that aspect of my personality rather than hide it behind a mask of spontaneous compassion. Strategic kindness isn't the opposite of authentic kindness, it's just kindness with better planning, more consistent execution, and clearer objectives. The mask I once wore has become integrated with my actual personality, not because I was deceiving myself about my true nature, but because I was learning to become the person I was pretending to be. Sometimes the most authentic thing you can do is admit that you've grown into someone better than you originally were, even if that growth started for less than noble reasons and required conscious effort rather than natural development. I am strategic. I am calculating. I am genuinely kind. And I've finally learned that these qualities don't have to contradict each other. They can work together to create a person who is both effective and caring, even if the caring was learned rather than instinctual. The most important lesson from this experience is that people are more complex than simple narratives of good or bad, authentic or fake, selfish or altruistic. We're all performing to some degree, and we're all learning to be better than we originally were. The question isn't whether you're naturally good, it's whether you're willing to do the work to become good, regardless of your starting point or initial motivations. Today, when people call me one of the kindest people they know, I accept the compliment without the internal guilt that once accompanied it. I am kind, even if I learn to be kind through practice and strategy rather than pure instinct. My helpfulness creates real value in people's lives, my support genuinely helps them through difficult situations, and my thoughtfulness makes their days brighter, regardless of how I developed these abilities. The terrifying realization that I might be fooling myself has transformed into something more peaceful. The understanding that becoming a better person is a choice you make every day, not a fixed trait you're born with. I chose to learn kindness as a strategy, but somewhere along the way, it became part of who I am. Maybe that's the most authentic thing about me, the willingness to become someone better than I started out being, one calculated act of compassion at a time. The mask didn't hide my true self, it helped me discover who I was capable of becoming. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's everything.